Yeah, so those are on the call, just to let you know that we're recording the meeting today. Hopefully, to be able to share it with those who are unable to join. We'll do some introductions in just a minute, but for those of you who may not be familiar with the Proud Science Alliance, we are a collective of healthcare and life sciences sector queer networks who work together to raise the bar on LGBTQ plus inclusion within our organizations in the sector as a whole. One of the ways that we do that is having and hosting discussions and events just like this. And we were just mentioning Pride in London, that was another thing. But certainly check out proudsciencealliance.org if you want to know more. With that, I'm not going to introduce either of you. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves, if that's okay. But I'm super excited to welcome you both. Clara, do you want to start? Let people know who you are and maybe your connection into our little group and our conversation.
Yeah, hey. So hi, everyone. I'm Clara Barker. I'm a material scientist at Oxford University. So I sort of very much come from the academia side of things, although I have worked in industry as well. Very publicly transgender and eternally online and mixture of vilified and almost deified. And yeah, I'm involved in all sorts of different projects, and I've done a lot of work with Pride in STEM. So I first joined the Proud Science Alliance to speak at an event that was co-hosted by Pride in STEM, and then I also spoke at London Pride as well, and matched with you guys this year, which was freaking awesome. It was so good, so much fun.
Yeah, amazing. So amazing to have you here. Jay.
Hey everybody, my name is Jay Garvey and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm calling from the East Coast of the United States, Vermont. So good morning to any other East Coasters in the US. I feel so blessed to have met Jay and Clara and others through a bilateral convening that happened in the UK last year when I was on a research fellowship for the year during my research sabbatical. And anything that involves queer and trans liberation and data and friendship and emotions is something that I jump into wholeheartedly. I'm formerly a queer and trans student services provider at a university in the US. And then I did the faculty thing for a while and started a research team called Cutie Pie, which stands for Queer and Trans People in Education. And then this past December, I jumped into a new administrative role as the executive director for institutional research and assessment, where I oversee all data concerning students and employees at the University of Vermont. I feel so excited to be here, and I'm ready for some good conversation.
Thanks for that. And like the energy is contagious in a way. I've been telling everyone, please come along because I'm so excited to be with you both. Yeah, just to have this conversation today. So thanks for being here. For those that don't know me, my name is Jay Sloan. My pronouns are they, them. I'm one of the co-founders and currently one of the co-chairs and look after programming for the Proud Science Alliance. Well, I worked in the pharma industry for 20 years. For the past almost 3 years, I've been working as an independent coach, consultant, writer, and speaker, and recently decided that artist to my list of things I do because I've been focusing on some artistic projects. So that's a little bit about me. So we're going to jump into the conversation now. And as Jay referenced, the three of us all met, at this big meeting last year at Wilton Park, and the focus of that meeting was really looking at, I guess, the idea of data and how it can be used to support this idea of inquiry into the state of LGBTQ plus inclusion in STEM. That was our connection, but I know from working a bit and connecting with Claire and Jay both, and because of the work that I do, our interests lie outside of that. But what I thought I'd do is kind of start there, and maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about what we took away from that meeting, and then get into it a little bit more. But what I wanted to reference first is that if you look at the research per se, or some of the reports coming out, some of the commentary, I would say in the wider news realm, I would say the media, then there is growing evidence that queer people are underrepresented in STEM fields. This is not going to come as a shock, I would say, to most people, who work in science and technology, engineering, and those fields. But I think what is coming through is more evidence, kind of data to support that. And some of the things that we face are certainly exclusion, harassment, and career limitations. And what I wanted to do is just reference just one study. And this is actually referenced in the report that I think that we shared as part of the invitation for this. That came out of the meeting last year. But and some of you may have even read this yourself. And it originally was published in Science Advances, but published as a Nature News article about 3 years ago. And it was the largest study that was done basically of queer scientists in the US. And the first bullet point there hit me kind of hard, I would say, the hardest in a way, because queer scientists are 20% more likely to experience some sort of professional devaluation. And it made me think about my own career and thinking, I've experienced that as well, just because I show up the way that I do. There's no other explanation for it, that people think I'm less serious, or I can't be taken seriously, or that because of the way that I lead, it's not in alignment with what expectations might be for a certain type of leader, let's say. But I think the other things that we're probably a bit more familiar with, that we do experience harassment. There are implications to both our physical and mental health through things like trouble sleeping or more depression, that kind of thing. I think, though, that the bottom line is that when it comes down to it, these statistics add up to some sort of result. And as a result, queer scientists are more likely to leave science, relative to our straight counterparts. So obviously, this is just one study, one kind of data point, so to speak, in the broader scheme of things. But this is where we can get into it a little bit and really think about when we, consider how do we know what's really going on? What can we shift, to increase attraction and retention of queer people in STEM, and what's getting in the way? These are the questions that we're going to focus on today, starting with the first one. And this is some of the stuff that we got into at the meeting last year. How do we know what's really going on? And certainly some of the two key bullet points from that report talk about data as essential, and that demographic data can be used for diagnosing the problem, but it's really in itself only one part of the problem. That's all I wanted to say to introduce it. Maybe open it up now. And I'm feeling I need to come to you first, Jay, with this one. And yeah, how do we know what's really going on?
I feel like as a statistician, I'm naturally a storyteller through numbers. And I think particularly for queer and trans communities, storytelling is an important part of our movement and coalition building, which is why, Jay, I remember back when you and I met, it felt like our mind strings and our heartstrings were connecting at the same time. And that's the beauty of queer and trans solidarity and people in STEM and education and the workforce broadly. So when I talk about numbers, I'm really rooting myself in community solidarity and storytelling because, yes, of course, it advances policies and resource allocation to minoritized communities. But more importantly, for me, it makes me feel seen and validated and in community and loved. And I think at the core of my advocacy is emotions and community, which is why I talk about data so passionately. I learned so much about data at the bilateral convening because from a US perspective, I found myself having to be scrappy for the 15 years that I've been doing this because sexuality and gender demographic variables, gender especially beyond the binary, rooted in cis normative assumptions, are not collected. There are very few institutions, colleges, universities that collect these data, and it wasn't until 2016 that the US Department of Education began their first data collection to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So for queer and trans researchers like myself in the US, we've had to create these in-house data sets, which has been really empowering and exciting. However, there's certain analytic and methodological limitations to that. So the cachet for policymakers is often federal data sets because there's a comparative analysis, it's nationally representative, and there's generalizability. And I'm going to get off on half a second because I think generalizability is rooted in white supremacist, cis heteronormative constructs, and we don't really need to have generalizability in statistics. But that's a whole nother quantitative queer rant that I could get on some other point.
Yes.
Policymakers, that's like the cachet. And so learning that in the UK and other parts in the higher ed world collect these data was astonishing to me because how politicized those data collections are in the US. So I'll leave it at that. I have so much more to share, but I'm
No.
very curious to see what y'all have to say too.
Yeah, Clara, why don't you come in there?
Yeah, I think I was going to talk about the politicization of this data. I think that was kind of exactly really what I wanted to talk about. And so many people that had lived, well, so there's some positives. Firstly was, what I count as the US civil service have actually been looking at this and had released a report prior to Wilton Park, even during the Trump presidency, which was a bit of a surprise. And the same is true at the moment. The British civil service are still looking at how to improve things, and they supported this project. And even after comments that were made publicly by the UK Secretary of State about getting equality and diversity out of STEM, I was invited to speak by, one of the departments within the civil service to speak about my experiences. So, the people at the top and the work that's actually been done isn't always the same. And that is a positive. So often we get told that, there isn't a problem because there isn't the data. So the first thing is acknowledging that there's a problem and starting to gather the data. That's only, that's the first step. It reminds me, quite a lot. Universities used to say there's no problem with sexual assault in universities. And then as soon as they gathered the data, they were like, oh, turns out there is. And it's like, well, why haven't you been listening to people? Because people have been saying this for years, very openly and very loudly. And, so in a similar, I'm not equating the two, but it's the same with data gathering on all sort of different characteristics as well. So we've got to gather that data. So it's great that we're gathering it. And it's great to see so many people from like the, national statistical offices and things like that actually talking and saying, we want to do this. We want to get this right. It's a very difficult thing because the thought is that you don't collect data that you're not going to use. But the trouble is, if you haven't been collecting this data, then you don't have access to look at the trends. So gathering data is really important. And I'm really glad to see that people are taking it seriously and do want to do this. And yes, it's really tricky. I mean, I'm on a project with a US group at the moment, and the words that we have and the words that they use, even within the LGBT, framework, is different. So we also have to be able to almost have a thesaurus or, lexicon, a dictionary. Because there's certain words that are out of favor, certain words that were historically used. So we've got to be able to bring that data in and also talk to each other. So that's really good. But I think that one big thing as well was that we really need this data, but a lot of people were talking and saying, look, we're nervous. Why is this data being gathered? Why is this being used? So I think that we just need to be very open and honest about why we're gathering the data, how it's going to be used, what it's for, and really sort of try and get across the positive, because I'd love to say that we look at the human experience and we make policies based on humans rather than numbers, but we have to have numbers as well, unfortunately, and that is what's going to shift people who are paying money, people in power. Yeah, so that's pretty much me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to pick up on a couple of points that you both made. I think the one that resonates so deeply with me is this idea of story. And I think even during the meeting, that kind of struck me because of the work that I was doing in a big corporate, let's say. A lot of times you do get overwhelmed, let's say, with trying to understand the collective experience. And you sometimes forget the individual stories. Everybody has their own story. And I think, how do you maintain both, I suppose? And that's what I'm hearing very clearly from you both. It's like we have to have the data, but then also remember, that basically the data represents individual stories. And I think one of the things that came out from the meeting last year too is this. I remember one of the participants talked about we do gather data, and we have like 57 choices or something like that for gender identity and sexual orientation, because they work with a lot of young people, and that's the demand. It's like I need to see myself. I need to be able to adequately indicate my identity. And I think so. How do you begin to collect that? But I think that's the connection between the both. So because I also was hearing a little bit of the argument, it's like it's too complicated. We got to simplify it, and I see that happening in some of the, I guess, demographic data collection points where I have to enter who I am, whether that be my title or my gender identity and stuff. And I'm typically an other, and I know that within the genderqueer community, there's lots of different ways to express your identity. But I think I agree, that I think working in a corporate, this is the last point that I wanted to make, is that there was no evidence. There was stories, that I was hearing across the world of people who were being discriminated against, or their personal story is that they felt they weren't able to progress in the same way relative to their straight counterparts, and I think, but there was no evidence because we didn't collect the data, and it was a bit of a hard journey to get to the place where the place that I was working said, yes, we're going to start doing that, even though it is difficult, find a way. And so I think this is what I'm hearing too, is there is a movement toward, despite all of the complexities and complications, that there's movement forward in that way. So how do we know what's really going on? I think it's an ongoing question that we need to hold, but at least we're making movement toward, this idea of data collection is one part of it. And I think through our work in different ways, we're also kind of supporting this idea of elevating voices, creating space for people to tell their stories and be clear about who they are. So we can move then to the second question, and maybe Clara, I'll come to you first, is what can we shift to increase attraction and retention for people in STEM fields? And I think I'm really curious to hear what you have to say first about this, but I think when we think about, just to be clear, attraction, when we talk about it, occurs from, I guess some people describe it as school to CEO. So it's really starting in secondary school. The reason why this is important, is because there is what we think about is at different points along the journey, there can be experiences where we might as queer people think this is not for me. It starts early, but then within university, graduate school, in the corporate world. And I think particularly as I'm involved in different kinds of work around work, the meaning of work and that sort of thing, retention also, this isn't about money or position. It's really about things like safety. Do I feel safe? Or do I belong here? Does this match my own values and that sort of thing? And these are things that are becoming more important. But Clara, I'll start with you. How would you answer this question?
Yeah, I think it's amazing how so often I often talk about my own experience of transitioning and say that, after I transitioned, nothing really changed. I changed my name, I changed my appearance slightly. I've always been a goth, so it's not that far off. But not much change. But it was just the fact that I was able to just be open, and it's not like I'm always talking about being trans or LGBT with other scientists. That's not the case. Obviously, I do when I get invited to, but on a day-to-day basis, it's just part of who I am. People accept it, and it's not like we've got to change the conversation to be like, oh, okay, so over lunch we've got to have a discussion about the non-heteronormative
Mm.
science workforce. No, like carry on, talk about science, but at least I know that I can I can just be myself. And so I think that part of that inclusion is just being accepted. Like we're not asking to change the conversations in terms of what's going on in science. When we're talking about science, let's talk about science, that's fine. But also we are bringing in more role models. I mean, part of the reason that I was going to leave science was because I just didn't see any trans people. In 15 years I'd met 2 gay people, which didn't match my experience, and neither of them were in my particular field. So that representation is really important, and I hear that across the board. It's going to take time to get people up to the CEO level. It's going to take a good amount of time before people are in that position, because either people have been hiding for a really, really long time and probably left science, or they've got to build up. They've got to get to that thing. There's more young people that I'm talking to now where they're a lot more. There's a lot more sort of blaseness about being LGBT, and a lot less like, oh yeah, no, it's fine, it's just who we are, which is great. They don't understand why we've been fighting so hard, and that's a nice thing to see, because it means that doesn't mean that there aren't still those barriers, but I think that it's being experienced less and less as a barrier, and so things are changing in that regard, and I'm really happy about that. And hopefully it does mean that more and more people are going to end up in that position of the CEO or at the top, which is really great. It takes, like I say, it takes a long time. For I think in science, women have been allowed to study science for 80 years and 60 years, and we're at the point where we've got maybe 25% of the population who identify as women are scientists. So just allowing people isn't enough. We've got to actually do physical work to bring people in to address the balances, whether it's race or disability. But a big part of another thing when it comes to retention, we've got to be honest. There's some people who will do everything they can and say anything they want to push people out because they are really worried. They know full well that in the past, certain groups have had a higher portion of the funding slice, right? We know that women, people of color, people with disabilities are less likely to apply for large funding grants in science and less likely to get them. So, of course, if we're trying to address that and make it equal for everyone, well, some people have got more competition now. So we've got to understand where that reticence comes from, or that pushback, because it's a real pushback. There's only so much money to go around, and we need to be honest about that. But we do have to figure out how we can stop people feeling that they can just say whatever the heck they want just because they have, maybe they've got tenure, maybe they happen to pull in a big science grant. That doesn't mean that they should be allowed to just say what they want about, people that they work with. It's going to have an impact all the way down the line, whether you're teaching students, whether you're training people, bringing people into your company. We've got to start addressing that a little bit more thoroughly, I think.
Yeah, lots of richness there. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm just going to go straight to Jay. And what do you have to add?
Thanks. When in the policy sphere, the bell of the ball is often deficit-based comparisons. And so policymakers and people who allocate resources love data that's like queer people are achieving lower outcomes or are less retained than hetero people. And that's helpful to policy and resource allocation and really harmful to people. And it can feel sad to be that deficit comparison. And what I would love to see is onus not on trans, non-binary, and queer people spotlighting achievement deficits, but having more of an ecological perspective to hold institutions responsible and people who have positional power responsible. And that's difficult to achieve while also maintaining our collective humanities as well, because what changes those is often these large deficit-based comparisons. The last note that I want to make is that sometimes people leaving is good for them and their wellness. And as a community, it's been really enlivening to see people being okay with and celebrating and embracing departure as a form of self-care and community survival.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I felt that right here because I guess for a couple of reasons, that was my personal experience as well. I think having worked in an industry where, or a particular company, I should say, I should specify and say, because I worked for 20 years at one company. And I think I had a variety of experiences. Luckily, a lot of them super positive, you know, and I think, but ultimately at the end, I think my expectations started here and got higher and higher and higher. Once I knew more about not just myself, but also the possibility, and also noticing through connections in my own network that other places were much more welcoming, I would say. And I got to the point where I was like, actually, I want to show up every day and not have to question who I am. I just want to show up as myself and literally experience what that feels like, you know? And so ultimately that's what I did, you know. I was like, I made the choice to kind of leave and do the work that I do now, I would say. I don't think that's atypical. And some of the work that I'm doing separate from this is around that idea, you know, like when enough is enough, or when do you get to the point where you make those choices? So I just wanted to touch on that point. I think, yeah, with the broader question, I think one of the things that I keep going back to is this idea of, in the past, maybe we dealt with overt and even sometimes aggressive oppression, you know. I think these days, the way I would describe it, I never walked into a building and people called me derogatory terms walking down the hallway. You know, it was never like that. It was much more subtle. And I think Kenji Yoshino wrote about this in his work around covering and that sort of thing, but these microaggressions and things like that, which is kind of a buzzword, I would say. You know, people kind of talk about that, but it's very real in terms of how people experience things. And it's so subtle that sometimes I felt a bit gaslit, you know, like, oh, it's not real, you know, but actually I was like, it is though. You know, I've had these experiences and it's like, I know my intuition is telling me the reaction of people is because of my queerness, you know. And so I think, yeah, so I think what's interesting about what we're kind of talking about here is touching on, I think, where we went to in the first question too, is dismantling some sort of system without getting into the specifics of it, because it's a whole topic on its own, you know. But I think, but certainly doing the work, you know, beyond having awareness days, you know, or having events during Pride Month and things like that. So it's like, it's really working within a system and saying, how can we dismantle some of those things? The difficulty is, I think both of you touched on this, but it's like when you have people in positions of power, why would they want to give it up? You know, it's harder, you know, to do that, particularly when you're talking about funding in academia, but also in the corporate world is more like positions of power and the money that comes with that, I would say. And so I think there's some challenges there. I think, yeah, and I think, yeah, I think the other thing, maybe just to touch on really quickly too, is I think we touched on this initially too, is this idea of community and what makes the difference and how can you retain people. I think this one of the reasons for the PSA, but also networks internally at different organizations, is because we all need those connection points. And I think one of the things, particularly within the queer community, that I've noticed is a lot of times we show up in a room and we're just the only one, or, you know, we're used to being isolated in that sense. And I think what I've learned is through my own experiences that there is power and community. And it's always okay to say, I need your support. You know, I I need you around me because I'm going into this situation where I feel uneasy, so if it doesn't go well, I need to come back and kind of talk about it. And I think that's the power of networks and also queer community. And so I think that's one of the things that really does help often, if we can create that. I wish there was some sort of magic wand, that we could kind of wave and fix the problem. But I think it's more long term. I think, Claire, this is what you were mentioning. It's over time. And I reminded myself, actually, because I've been working with smaller companies the last couple of years, some of them biotechs, and I've been super impressed, because they're just starting out and they're so intentional right from the start. And I think that gives me hope for the future, where we see these organizations saying, we want to be inclusive, just as we're starting out. So let's see what happens. So another big question, maybe come to you first, Jay, with this. I mean, we talk about, kind of what we need to do, some ideas, about what's, sort of happening, how we can retain queer people into STEM, but yeah, what's getting in the way?
Maybe it's because I'm just feeling saucy this morning, but I'm going to say a few opinionated things.
Yes.
And it's also going to be a call out for organizations and a call in for our communities. And so I'm going to start with the latter first. I think, especially for me as a cis white man, it's decentering myself, my ego, and recentering community and intersectional justice to understand the interrelatedness of oppression. And so in movement building, none of us should want to be center stage. We should be pulling people up and having just a shared liberatory experience. And so I often have to remind myself of the privileges that I hold as a cis white man, especially in these spaces. And so that's one thing. The second, data and reports and state of the unions are not the endpoint in itself. So I think like it's empowering for us to be a part of those experiences. And it's that quick jolt of achievement, because Jay, as you mentioned, this movement building is enduring and can be so liberating and so exhausting. So I think that if we celebrate those short victories of increased data access and of reports and of commissions and pulling ourselves together, that's wonderful. And I also think collectively we need to demand more of organizations than just an annual State of the Union or collecting sexual and gender identity information. I also think that I think a lot about community organizing and movement building and activism, and it's our responsibility to steward more people into these conversations, because yes, finances and data will change administrators' perspectives, as will collective movement building and activism and sharing our demands. And I think that's where intersectional justice comes into play, because if we as queer and trans people are rightfully so saying, we're here, we're queer, damn it, give us our rights and a better work environment, our voices will only elevate so far. But, as a small example, all gender restroom facilities benefit people with disabilities and disabled people, caretakers, including parents and other caretakers. And so when we can build movements around shared solidarity, then there's more voices to elevate, and our voices will be heard in more profound ways.
Amazing. I'm going to hold my comments, even though I like getting chills and like little goosies while I'm listening. Certainly a lot resonates. But Claire, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to carry on from what Joe's been saying, and just sort of, because there's a few statements there that I also say in my own my own way. This idea of the thing is, we've got to get in the room. We've got to be in the room, and sometimes we're going to hear things that we don't want to hear. Sometimes we're going to have to deal with people that we fundamentally disagree with. But I often say I spend most of my time patting people on the head for doing the bare minimum, because that means they're going to listen to me more, right? That means that they're going to invite me along to the next thing. So if we do the sandwich of this is good, this is bad, this is good, then I get invited to those rooms. And it's important, as Jay said, once you're in that position, and it's important to get in the room, then start bringing other people into the room as well, because there's a lot of experiences that I can't bring, obviously. So I need to bring that in. We should also, as has been touched on, celebrate our wins, because if we just look at where we have gains to make, we forget to celebrate the positive stuff, and that's really depressing. And the number of times I'm in a really privileged position right now where I work with students who 8 years ago, they were fighting for like a particular rule to be changed. And they fought for this for 3 years and never saw it change. But if I see them now, I can be like, hey, because of what you did, it did change. It just takes a while. And so, remembering that there is positive and remembering to share people's achievements with them. And another thing is role models. We talked about role models, the importance of seeing people, but and I think this is what you were getting at, Jay, is that it's not just about bringing in a colleague to talk about being Black on Black History Month. It's about bringing in a Black colleague to talk about their expertise in their stuff that they are very, very knowledgeable about. It's about making sure that we're purposefully bringing people in all through the year to talk about expertise, not who they are. That's really important, because that becomes true representation then. Don't get me wrong, I still like talking for LGBT History Month. My diary next month is full, but we should be bringing in people to talk throughout the year. And one final thing, and I think this sort of follows on again from previous conversations, and I forgot to mention it earlier, but so often we're talking about data, and data is really important, and we need to bring in data. The trouble is, it's really quite hard to convince people to change if they just see the negative data. So this is how many people we've lost. This is how many people are leaving STEM. What's really working in the financial sector, for instance, they've just released the third McKinsey report showing about the benefits of diversity in the workplace, and how having diverse workforce, what positive it brings the company. So of course companies are willing to spend lots of money on pride events, sponsoring it and stuff like that, because they know that they get more money at the end of the day. I mean, is it the moral thing to do? Of course it is, but they know that more diverse workforce gives them profit. What we don't have in the STEM field right now is that similar sort of report, and it's probably the same for other things. We don't have something that says, we've got a lot of reports that say this is negative, people are leaving, but we don't have anything to say, hey, here's the benefits. And I think that having positive data, positive reports is really quite important as we start to move into the next stage of the fight for equity. We need to start bringing through those positive stories. And unfortunately, yeah, we shouldn't have to, sort of profit from diversity. We should want companies to just do it, but we're not there yet. So we need to start finding those positive stories, I think.
Yeah. Amazing, good points. And you've opened my eyes a little bit about what's next in a way, like what's getting in the way and how can we address it. I think this idea of positive data is a really, really solid one. I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, Jay, that really resonates, because I've been working with, as I mentioned, some smaller companies, a couple of which, we did some work last year basically around queer inclusion or just inclusion in general. And the questions are coming back to me now, what now? Like, what do we do this year? And I'm like, my strong sense is this idea of intersectionality. It's like, because I think that the tendency is to look at things in isolation, and I think even myself, I think I like to look at my identity at intersection with my privilege. Jay, you touched on this, because even though I'm an immigrant, I was thinking about this today because I just got my new British passport. I'm American by birth and I have an American passport too. well, I'm an immigrant too, not really in the same sense, you know, because I was welcomed here and like I integrated very easily and I'm accepted and I've had it's basically a privilege, you know. So I think, but I think if we can talk about that more, you know, our multiple identities would be really helpful. And I think getting into a little bit more about, you know, beyond the conversation or the I think what a or the lack of conversation around privilege because people don't like it, it makes you feel uncomfortable. But I think the way I like to introduce it is it's not a bad thing. It's just basically this is my experience, you know, and it's just about recognizing it. And I think what you touched on is really important one about how are we using that, you know, and I think that goes for the queer community too, because I think I have this principle that I call like standing up and standing out. I think standing up is the first thing that we can do, and I think within organizations, I think both mentioned this idea of role models. I think we all have our own journeys. We all get to make the choice, you know, whether we want to be out or not. But I think at some point, you know, it's important to at least stand up and say, I'm here. This is who I am, particularly as leaders, you know, because we do need more people in leadership positions, you know, to talk about their identity in a very open way. And then the next step of that is, you know, kind of standing out and saying, I'm not just going to show up at events. I'm not going to support it, maybe give a bit of money, but actually what I'm going to do is use my voice. Or in certain cases, I'm going to step back and create a platform or space for somebody else's voice to be heard, you know. And I think that definitely does get in the way a little bit because it can be. I know from experience, I'm not a natural speaker. I'm quite shy, and I had to make the choice, you know, to kind of step into that space, and it was an active choice. And I've been on this whole journey myself, and I love working with people to support them into the space itself, because if I can do it, anyone can, you know. And I think I consider myself an activist now, but I think an accidental activist maybe. But these days I love a protest, all of that. But I think if we, yeah, certainly collectively more so make those decisions, recognizing that there is an emotional toll, you know, an emotional labor involved in the work that we do. That that I think that can certainly help, you know, kind of shift. And I think within organizations, just bringing it back to this idea of storytelling, one of the most powerful things that I've ever experienced is creating space for people to tell their stories, you know. And I think if we can simply do that more, I think that always helps, you know. And I think even better if we can do it in a very intersectional way. Hopefully those on the call benefited from hearing some of those ideas. I'm going to pause there though, because I wanted to open it up. I know we have several people on the call. We've enjoyed the conversation, I hope, but we hope you have too. And the reason I wanted to pause is simply to open it up, and any reflections or questions or comments based on what you heard, and also feel free to bring in your own thoughts and ideas. And you can do that either just by coming off mute, or typing something into chat. And while you're thinking and kind of doing that, just a reminder to stay connected with us. And these are ways to do that. What I'm going to do is stop sharing so we can come back to the group. And I think what I'll do now too is stop the recording, maybe to make it a bit more comfortable as well for anyone who wants to